Turn with me in your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 6. A lot of times in the book of Proverbs, the writer of Proverbs sometimes he shows us what wisdom is by showing us what foolishness is. He says, in essence, here's what not to do. He helps us, sometimes tells us what to pursue, sometimes he tells us what to avoid. And here in Proverbs chapter 6, there are three categories of people that the writer of Proverbs cautions us to be like. And we're going to look at each one of these three. So look with me in Proverbs chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. He says, "My son, if you have put up security for a neighbor, have given your pledge for a stranger, if you are snared in the words of your mouth, caught up in the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. For you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, hasten and plead urgently with your neighbor. Give your eyes no sleep and your eyelids no slumber. Save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the hand of the fowler." The first category he calls us to avoid is someone who has money problems. What's he talking about here when he says, if you have put up security for your neighbor, if you have given your pledge for a stranger? Basically, he's talking about what we might say is co-signing a loan. Right? Basically, you are entering into financial risk for somebody else's speculative gain. Now, notice what he says there, because the person he talks about, he calls a neighbor, but he also calls a stranger. Right? This is not saying it's a sin to do this. If you're a parent and your kids are trying to save up and buy their first car, it's not a sin to co-sign the loan with them. But again, Proverbs is about wisdom. And one of the ways that he calls us to be wise is to be wise with our money. And he says, when you are co-signing, when you are entering into this, you make a pledge, you are putting yourself at financial risk. You're putting your financial security, your ability to take care of your family into the hands of someone else. In the early 60s, my grandfather, my mom's dad, he worked at a place called Columbia Gas. They were a natural gas company there in Lexington, and he got talked into co-signing a loan for $25,000 from one of his coworkers. And so Pappy did that, and within a year, the guy had fled the country. And my grandfather was left with this loan. He put his financial security, he put his ability to provide for his family in the hands of someone else. God says if you do this, it's not that you will be ensnared. He says you already are ensnared. You mean the language that is used here, save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the hand of the fowler. These words that he uses, he uses hunting terms, right? To be caught up in this is to be ensnared. It's to be entrapped financially. Now let's be clear what this is not saying. In no way is this saying that we should not be generous. The Bible completely encourages generosity. In Deuteronomy, God tells his people in Deuteronomy 15 to loan to the poor. Every 7 years in Israel, you had that Sabbath year and debts were forgiven. So you have in Israel, you have this culture of generosity. One of the things that God judges his people for in Jeremiah and Ezekiel is that they have failed to be a generous people. God says, I am a generous God. I freed you from slavery. I rescued you and delivered you from this. I've provided for you. And when you fail to reflect that generosity, God says that it's sin. So this is not saying that lending money is a sin. It is not saying we should not be generous and just keep everything to ourselves. Most scholars, what they think is going on here is not just, I'm going to help somebody out. Why would you co-sign, why would you enter into financial risk with somebody you don't know very well? It's to get a cut of it. What he is doing here is he's talking about making an unwise financial decision for the sake of future financial gain. Somebody's thinking, I'll co-sign on this. I'll enter into this pledge with them. I'm going to get a cut of it. And the writer of Proverbs is saying, but you are entering into such a dangerous situation. You are ensnared. You are held in the hands of another. Your well-being is entrusted to somebody else. And really at the core of it, what the writer of Proverbs is telling us is that we cannot entrust our financial situation to somebody else. Recently, we saw some slot machines. And Henry, man, all the noises and the lights. Oh, this is neat. Dad, can I play that game? No. I said, we don't do that. Well, why not? Well, how do you explain this to a 5-year-old? I said, well, I said, God has designed a system where we work and we get something for our work. We reap and we sow. We make effort. We get return from that effort. But gambling is based on the idea of getting something for nothing. Gambling is, I don't really have to work. I don't really have to do anything. And I'm going to pay this money in the hopes of getting something in return. I had a great aunt, and my grandmother would drive her home from work, and often I'd ride with her. And every single day, my grandmother had to stop at the gas station by my great aunt's house so my aunt could run into the store and come out with her lottery tickets. And every day she'd come out, Michael, when I win, your education's going to be paid for. Can I tell you something? She should have just taken all that money she spent on lottery tickets and put it in a bank account for my education, because she never won anything. When we tie our financial success to somebody else, when we entrust, I'm going to do this, I'm going to pay into this so that maybe possibly I can get my money back. When we tie up our financial hopes with others, the writer of Proverbs is saying it's dangerous. God has called on us to take care of our families. God has called on us to provide for ourselves. And we work, and there's return for our work. We work, and there is reward for the effort. But to simply entrust it to other people, and even more unwise, to try and pay in to just get more out later, is unwise. And so he cautions us against doing that. Let me just tell you, one of the things that I just have learned practically, and somebody told me years ago, if you loan somebody money, just don't expect to ever see it again. Because what happens a lot of times is when we do this and we put financial hopes in other people, not only does it hurt us financially, it creates rifts in relationships. I mean, I have seen brothers not talk to each other over $500. Well, he didn't ever pay me back. Yes, I did. You just don't remember. And two brothers not talk to one another. They're tying their financial hopes up in somebody else. And wisdom says that we ought to guard ourselves. We ought to be generous. And we ought to live in such a way where we can afford to help others out, and we can afford to provide and be a blessing to others. But if we put our hopes in the actions of others to provide for us, it's going to be a problem. And so first he talks about somebody with money problems, but then look in verse 6 at the second kind of person he talks about, someone who is undisciplined. He says in verse 6, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard, when you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." He mentions the sluggard. Now, in the book of Proverbs, there are two villains that we will encounter over and over throughout the book. One is the sluggard, the other is the fool. Both of these people are brought up, and the writer of Proverbs repeatedly talks about them. And the sluggard is just somebody who's undisciplined, somebody who's lazy, somebody who who just kind of floats through life, somebody who doesn't pay attention to what's around them. The sluggard is somebody who is slow. They're hesitant when they should be decisive. They just sort of drift. And God says to this sluggard, God is saying, you need to go and you need to get a lesson from nature. You need to be taught by an ant. Now here are these ants. Ants are tiny little things. They're all around us. And God says that we can learn a lesson from them. He says that somebody who's lazy, somebody who's undisciplined, they can go and they can look at an ant and they can get some lessons. What lessons can you get from an ant? What in the world can an ant teach you? Well, 3 things. One is inner motivation. He says in verse 7, without any chief, officer, or ruler. That is, if you go out and you bend down to the ground and you see a bunch of ants, there aren't all those ants moving in their line, doing their task, and another ant standing off to the side telling them what to do, is there? They don't say, here's how you work. Hey, you got to stay on task. There is not an ant who comes and says, okay, here's what we're going to do today. Here's how we're going to plan out our day. These ants, they've got this inner motivation where they work. They work hard. They don't have to be told what to do. Nobody has to stay on them to say, are you doing what you're supposed to do? Are you working the way you're supposed to be working? Are you being diligent? They're self-motivated. And we ought to be wise enough to motivate ourselves to get the job done. We, as people, we should not have to wait until we're told what to do. You know, as a kid, I remember you get to that point in childhood where, okay, Mom, I've done everything you've told me. And my mom goes, well, it's not enough. Well, but she said you should do it without being told. That's part of maturing. Right? When your kids are really little, you say, okay, here's what I want you to do today, and you tell them. But at a certain point in their life, you should not have to tell them certain things. And you shouldn't have to say to an 18-year-old, have you showered today? Have you brushed your teeth? Right? Those things ought to come naturally. Those things ought to be part of self-motivation. Part of the problem, one of the things that is so destructive in our culture is we are unleashing young adults into the world and they've never been taught self-motivation. I mean, I read an article about how corporate businesses, how CEOs are having to field phone calls from parents because the boss is being too tough on their kid. This is insane. We as parents ought to teach our kids to be motivated, but we ought to teach them by them seeing it in us. And God says these ants, no one's having to tell them what to do. No one's having to lay out a plan for them. They look and they figure this out. They work and they keep working. They're motivated from within. There's initiative there. They look to see what needs to be done. They don't just wait around to be told to do something. You know, one of the things that is a sign of maturity and a sign of wisdom is we don't just wait to be asked to do something. We don't wait to ask to help somebody or serve someone. We don't wait to ask to be a blessing. If we see a need because we're looking for a need, we meet a need. And we ought to have this initiative, just like these ants do, that we are always working, always looking to see what we can do. But the second lesson we learn from them is not just inner motivation, but hard work. He says she prepares her bread in summer. One of the reasons I don't like picnics very much is because ants are hard workers. You set your food down on the ground, you turn around, and they're all over the stuff. Now, this is summer. This is when it's hot. This is when the weather's not so nice, and these ants, they're working. And you look at them. I forget the number, but ants, the amount of weight that they can lift proportionate to their bodies, like they can lift 50 times their body weight or something. I mean, they just are always working. You see these little tiny ants, and they're carrying these big pieces of bread. And they work hard, and you can watch, and they just keep working. You set out something, and man, they'll just keep working. Sometime you go and you'll see something on the ground, and you'll see a bunch of ants around it, and they're all collecting it. And you just watch. Guess what? They work until the job's done. They don't say, well, it's closing time. It's 5 o'clock. We're just going to head back into the ant hole for the evening. No, they just keep getting it. Ants are hard workers, and so we need to be. Unlike the sluggard who just sits around and does nothing, we ought to work hard, even when it is hard. Even when things are tough, and even when conditions may not be ideal, we keep working and we work hard. But third, not only is their inner motivation, not only is there hard work, there's future preparation. She gathers her food in harvest. You don't see ants during the winter very much. Why? Because ants get their food for the winter already. Ants, they're diligent. They plan ahead. I mean, do you understand how great God is that He creates these animals who, though so tiny and though so seemingly insignificant, realize the need to plan ahead? They store food up. They come at the harvest. They get their food and they have it so that during the winter they've got stuff to eat. Part of what we need to do, part of being wise, is the ability to plan ahead. It's the ability to save money for when difficulty comes. It's the ability to plan time, to spend with our family. It's the ability to not just think in the moment, not just think, how does this affect me now, but to plan and to think ahead, to strategize and to work so that when the future comes, when things may not be ideal, we're prepared for it. And it's so easy for us to ask, why would God care about somebody being lazy? Aren't there bigger problems in the world? I mean, he's not talking about somebody killing anybody here. He's not talking about somebody who's going out. Here's the problem with the sluggard. The sluggard is given a day of life as a gift of God's grace, and they waste it. The problem with being a sluggard is God, in His generosity and God in His kindness, says, here is a day to serve me. Here is a day to be a blessing. Here is a day to grow. And what are they concerned with? A little sleep? A little slumber? A little folding of the hands to rest? And they just want a little out of life. They just go through life and they waste the life God gives them. Jesus says, I came that you might have life abundantly. It is God's desire that we make the most of the life that He gives us, that we serve Him most faithfully and most fruitfully with the life He gives us. And to just spend life coasting and to just spend life saying, oh well, is dishonoring to God. It is taking the gift that God gives us and saying, yeah, I really don't care. I'd rather do what I want to do. I'd rather just sort of laze through my days than work for you. See, the connection between somebody who is financially unwise and the lazy person is there in verse 11. Poverty will come upon you like a robber and want like an armed man. You see, first God warns about somebody who, in order to try and gain money, puts themselves in financial risk. But second, He warns about somebody who puts themselves at financial risk simply because they don't do anything. He talks about how we shouldn't tie ourselves up financially, but then second, He talks about how we shouldn't make ourselves so that we live in want. Again, God has created a culture of generosity. There are times when people have financial want because they go on hard times. There are times when people, they work hard, they make great effort, and times are still tough financially. And God in His grace provides, and God has given us the privilege of ministering to people like that. It's not what He's talking about to just say that it's wrong to have financial need. What He's talking about, though, is that if we have financial need, it ought not be because we've just been sitting around and doing nothing. It ought not be because we've just been lazy and we've wasted our days. And so often, we as a culture, we enable this idea that you get something for nothing. And it is harmful to people. It is unwise. And so God says that we can't be like this sluggard who just wants so little out of life, but we need to take the life God gives us, and we need to work hard, and we need to be diligent, and we need to be motivated so that we can make the most out of the life that God gives us for His glory. But look at this last person, because God reserves His harshest language for them. In verse 12, God says, a worthless person, a wicked man, goes about with crooked speech, winks his eyes, signals with his feet, points with his finger, with perverted heart devises evil, continually sowing discord. Therefore calamity will come upon him suddenly. In a moment he will be broken beyond healing. There's 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to Him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil. A false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. Now God warns us about being someone who is divisive. This is not gentle language, is it? I mean, if you look, the tone shifts from the sluggard to all of a sudden God says someone is worthless. Now that sounds strange to us. How could God call somebody worthless? Matter of fact, it even gets worse than that, because the word that He uses there is Belial. It's the same word that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians as a name for the devil. He is saying that you are worthless. Right? Somebody who tries to foster division, somebody who is divisive, somebody who tries to sow discord is worthless and wicked in the eyes of God. This is not meant to be gentle. This is not meant to be calm. And this is why sometimes we don't see sin the way God does, because sometimes we act as if saying things, the words we speak, they're really not that harmful. But sometimes when we have this crooked speech, this speech that's intended to sow discord, when we wink with our eyes, again, somebody's talking and somebody's standing behind him going, oh, and you're doing all this stuff, you're making all these nonverbal gestures, trying to undercut what they're saying. He says, with your feet, you're signaling. What are you signaling? It's because you're going to hurt. You're pointing. You're looking to cause trouble. Point with your finger, you accuse. Your heart devises evil. And what is all of that? It is continually sowing discord. Somebody who goes around, and it doesn't matter what the situation is. It doesn't matter what the scenario is, whether it's somebody at work who goes around and somebody gets the promotion that you felt you deserved, and so you start to try and turn others against them. Whether it's in your family, somebody you just don't like, and you run them down. And certainly, one of the greatest avenues that we see this in is churches. Can you imagine that? A church, a place that is meant for worship of God, a place that is meant to exalt His name, and there are people who come week in and week out, and their goal is not to unite. Their goal is not to praise God. Their goal is to try and get their way by creating divisiveness among others. Sometimes it's just in a Sunday school class. Sometimes it's in a choir. Sometimes it's in the church in general. But we cannot view those things as no big deal, because God, the language He uses here, shows us what a giant deal it is. That to seek to sow discord is to be rendered worthless and wicked. And God God sent His Son to bring people together. I mean, we talked about that this morning, the reconciliation that is possible only because of what Christ has done. Christ has come to unite us in Him, but somebody who comes along and seeks to divide people, they are anti-gospel. They are anti-Christ. They are working against Him. They are working counter to Him. And a lot of times it starts because we don't get our way in something. We have things turn out the way we don't like, and we don't see our act as the evil that it is. But God, here in Proverbs, helps us with that. He says there in verse 16, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to Him. Now, this is a literary device. It's not saying that of the 7, there are only 6 that He hates, but all 7 are an abomination. No, it's basically, what it's doing is it's a way to signal us. We see it several times in the book of Proverbs. And what He's saying is of these 7 things, the thing that will be listed last is the thing that God detests the most. The thing that is mentioned there, the last, is the one that is the greatest offense to God. And you see these things, haughty eyes, somebody who's proud, right? Where does divisiveness start? Divisiveness starts when you look at others and you look down on them. When you see yourself as better than them, when you see yourself as one to whom they are accountable, you see yourself as one that they have to meet your expectations and they have to work toward. He speaks of haughty eyes and a lying tongue. Then he says hands that shed innocent blood. Do you get this? God is equating, God is saying that sowing discord is as bad as murder. That creating strife and creating division is as bad as killing somebody. That when you go around and you say, well, did you know this? And what about this? And you are seeking to gossip. You're seeking to say it. You might go, well, it's not killing somebody. But God says it's the same. It is destroying a person. It is destroying a community. It is destroying a church. God says a heart that devises wicked plans. Again, you see the evil here. It's not just that you do something evil. It's that you think, what can I do that is evil? How can I create problems? How can I stir the pot? Quite frankly, I've seen people like this in churches before. And you can just watch the wheels turning in their heads. And they're going to try and say things. They look for opportunities in conversation to insert their opinion, to insert a word that's meant to hurt. They look for opportunities to try and run somebody down. Well, did you know so-and-so did this? Well, did you know so-and-so? I saw them the other day. Now, don't tell anybody. This is a prayer request. But here's what they were doing. That's just between us. And then they turn around and tell somebody else. But this is just between us. And there is a devising of evil because people are looking for an opportunity to sow discord. He said their feet make haste to run to evil. Again, contrast this with the sluggard. What does the sluggard do? The sluggard does nothing. He just sits around and he does nothing. But here is somebody, and the depth of their evil is such that they make effort. They expend energy trying to create problems. They look to see who they can talk to. They look to see how they can create division. They want you to see them. They want to be noticed. They breathe out lies. That is that the words from their mouth are just not true. But the writer of Proverbs doesn't just say they lie, because this is a picture of their character. They don't just lie sometimes, do they? What does it say? They breathe out lies. That is, the picture is everything that comes out of them is a lie. Like that old joke, you know how so-and-so's lying? Their lips are moving. I mean, that's what they're talking about here. And this person sows discord among brothers. One of the greatest challenges you see in the New Testament, in the writings of Paul, as Paul writes to these churches. Really, what was the first problem in the church there in Acts? It was division. Who caused the first problem in the church? I'm not saying that this is always true, but I'm just saying it was little old ladies. And they did it by sowing division. Well, they're not treating us as nice as they're treating them. They're ignoring us and they're paying all their attention to them. And instead of saying, hey, we need help too, instead of trying to ask for help, they sow discord. And sweet little old ladies are the problem there in the church. And so God, in His grace, sends this plan where deacons can come and they can serve and they can help. In 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians is a book about what division looks like in a church. You've got there, as Paul writes in the beginning, and we as Christians, we're so good because we baptize our division. Well, I was baptized by Apollos. Ooh, I was baptized by Peter. I was baptized by Paul. Well, me, I'm of Christ. And here's the super spiritual bunch. We're better than all y'all. And in every single case, what they are doing is they are taking their fake spirituality and they're using it to drive a wedge among themselves. If you even go further in the book, right, they have all these theological differences. Well, I can speak in tongues, you can't. And the thing that Paul says is a gift of God's grace, they're using to boast and they're using to be arrogant. And when we, as Christians, when we let our pride and we let our arrogance, we let our self-centeredness create divisions, we are being worthless and we are being wicked. It doesn't matter how pious our language sounds, and it doesn't matter how much good we think we can accomplish. Listen, God in His Word has given us plans to how to deal with problems and how to deal with problems in the church. And sometimes that needs to happen. But the answer is never to create division. The answer is never to talk behind somebody's back. The answer is never to create more problems. And as we read these, it seems so disparate. Why you have a guy who is a co-signer on a loan, a lazy man, and a scoundrel who just creates division among people. It's like, what in the world? Why? How did these three things, you just sitting there going, who's a bad person that I can think about? Oh, yeah. A lazy person and somebody who creates division. But there is a common bond between these three. Because the first two, through their foolishness, through their passiveness, have placed themselves under the power of somebody else. They have made themselves subject to another, whether it's by entering alone and tying yourself up financially to somebody else, or by being lazy and putting yourself in a situation where poverty and want, as it says, is going to come. And so you are dependent on others. But then in this third case, you have somebody who, because they are haughty, because they're proud, because they think that they're so much better, they try and put themselves in power over other people. They try and exercise their authority, and they try and get people to do what they want them to do, and in the process, they sow discord. And the thing that all three have in common is that they neglect God. All three of them forget Him. All three of them fail to trust in Him. All three of them fail to submit to Him. And to neglect God in the book of Proverbs is the very epitome of what foolishness looks like. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This recognition of God and this humility and submission to God, that is where wisdom begins. But all three of these people, they have neglected God altogether, and there is nothing more foolish than that. And in every area of our lives, whether it be financially, whether it be with our work and our effort and how we go about each day, whether it be with our emotions, the thing we think and how we act out those feelings. Every single thing we do ought to signify that we know we are under the authority of God and we gladly and humbly submit to Him as King. That's what wisdom looks like. But when we neglect Him and we try and do our own thing and try and accomplish our plan for our life and neglect God's, there is nothing we can do that is more foolish than that. And so we need to trust in His wisdom, we need to submit to His authority, and we need to seek to demonstrate wisdom in every area of our lives so that when people see us, they see a people who are totally committed to serving God and honoring Him with all we have and all we are. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, Lord, we thank You so much for Your goodness and Your kindness to us. And God, we thank You for Your word which guides us and Your word that teaches us and points out foolishness in our own thoughts and actions. And God, the greatest form of foolishness is for us to neglect You, for us to look past You, and for us to ignore You, for us to presume upon You instead of submit to You. And God, maybe it's not one of these three areas. Maybe there's another area of our life where we neglect You. But Father, I pray that You would help us see any foolishness in our life and in our hearts that looks past You. And God, I pray that we would demonstrate the wisdom that we need to, that You provide for us by honoring You. Lord, I pray that everything we say and everything we do would honor You. And Lord, I pray during this time of invitation, if we need to confess an area which we're being foolish, Father, that as You bring that to mind, we do that. But God, I pray that all of us ask for more and more wisdom, because there's not one of us in this room that's not in need of more. And You graciously tell us that if we lack wisdom, all we have to do is ask. So God, I'm asking for me. Provide the wisdom that I'm lacking. Help me grow so that I can more faithfully show Your control and Your goodness in my life. And it's in the name of Christ we pray. Amen.